All right, good morning, everybody. 1 second to get situated. And today we're going to be covering, as the title said, biodiversity. Full screen. Full screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, the title slide isn't working, so we're just going to go on to the second slide. All right, looking at the outline for today, we're going to talk about biodiversity and species definitions. Okay, is this frozen? Got it. Close. But okay, apparently it doesn't go past that point. So we're going to do biodiversity and species definition, benefits of biodiversity, threats to biodiversity, and human cause reductions. Things to protect biodiversity, like the ESA, which last time when we talked about threats to this, we had the minimum viable populations, which are established by ESA, cities, and captive breeding. Okay, let's see if it works here. So biodiversity and species. So biodiversity types, you have a couple different kinds. So genetic diversity is a big one that's been a topic of interest lately. Because in this, again, the definition measures a variety of different versions of the same gene. Different versions of the same gene, meaning if you were to take into account like height, right? You have some that are short, some that are tall, and a variety that's in between there. And so having a high amount of genetic diversity is thought to be a good thing, because if a disease or some environmental factor comes in or some pushback, once certain traits are eliminated or once certain versions of that gene are eliminated, then you will have or through natural selection, then you'll have remaining versions of those genes left. There's also species diversity, which is the measures the number of different kinds of an organism within a community. So thinking about areas where there's very low species diversity, like in the Arctic Circle, and looking at areas with very high species diversity, like the tropics. There is kind of this misnomer that the high amount of species diversity is good. But there's been arguments lately to kind of say that, there are some areas where species diversity is low because the environments are so extreme that only those that can survive there will survive there. So take into account alpine and Arctic tundras. Those areas have a low amount of species diversity because they're so hard and so difficult to survive in. And the species that are there have kind of earned their way there through natural selection. And so adding more species to that area can be detrimental to them. This is why there's this argument for or against species diversity. There's also ecological diversity. This is measures of richness and complexity of a community. So this kind of takes into account, yes, you have species diversity, but it's not just species diversity. It's how many of the different types of species you have and where they're located at. If you want to increase species diversity, you could have, if you, as soon as you add in an additional species, you've added in a different number to that. So now you've increased the amount of organisms you have in a community by 1 and the number of different organisms by 1, but it doesn't actually paint the whole picture. And that's when ecological diversity kind of comes into play. So what are species? This is a big argument that's currently, or that's been ongoing in biology for the longest time. But a species is organisms of the same kind that are able to breed in a natural or in nature and produce fertile offspring. So this adds in a little bit of confusion. All right, this adds in a little bit of confusion because there are species that are different but are not. So this definition gives rise to the term reproductive isolation, which is how some species are reproductively incompatible, either pre or post zygotic. And so like pre-zygotic, meaning that they're reproductively incompatible, as in it doesn't form a zygote. So it can either be mechanical reasons, temporal reasons, ecological reasons. There's different reasons that go into why they won't reproduce, geographical. But then there are also post-zygotic, which would be like a horse and a donkey can reproduce, but they make a mule, which is not fertile. But then there are two species of sunflower that are considered to be separate species that can reproduce, and yet they form a viable offspring that is capable of reproducing itself. So then that's where you kind of have this exception and these exceptions, and it adds in some disambiguity as to what a species is. The underlying idea is that reproductive isolation prevents gene exchange and gives rise to new species, as in species diverge evolutionarily to the point where they can no longer reproduce with each other. But hybridization, again, creates a dilemma in here. Species identification is often based on morphological characteristics. So an example of a hybrid is, in my front yard, I have a London plain tree. Very, very common. It is a combination of a oriental plane tree and an American sycamore. And why is that an issue? Well, I have this massive tree in my front yard, and it also every single year produces seeds. And those seeds can go on to produce new organisms if it wasn't for a mower. And so you have this kind of like, what's going on here kind of question. But also, DNA sequencing has really helped out with doing a lot of this species identification. Rather than just saying, you know, this tree looks different than this tree, we now have DNA evidence to kind of support why they should be different species. So how many species? Currently, there's 1.4 million species identified. My dog is drinking water, and he's the world's loudest dog when doing that. The estimates actually range between 3 and 50 million, which means that there's a lot of them that we haven't identified. So if it's on the low end, 3 million, we're about 50%, a little under 50%. If it's around 50 million, then we're a little over 2% that we've identified. Around 30 million of this is insects. There are a lot of insects that are out there. There was an entomologist one time that was in a debate about it was a religious debate, and one of the things that was brought up is like, you know, if God exists, then he really loves beetles, because beetles happens to be the most diverse group of anything on the planet, and there's so many of them and so many different varieties. There's around 10 million species on the ocean floor. We sent a probe down to the Marianas Trench to Challenger Deep, which is the deepest point in the ocean that we know of. And we thought that it's too high pressure. Nothing can survive down here. And then when they flipped the lights on and looked around with the cameras, they saw life. And so it can exist almost everywhere. And because exploring the ocean has so many logistical difficulties in it, then it makes it very difficult to do surveys. One time there were, once DNA sequencing became a thing, we would take samples of ocean water and we'd plate them, as in put them on agar or reproductive medium, which is what bacteria and viruses and things use as food. We put it on there and see what grows, and nothing grew. And then we did the exact same thing, just took a scoop of water and sequenced all the DNA in it, and found that there were millions of species within there of bacteria and all sorts of other stuff. So it's one of those things where it's very difficult to kind of know what all is out there, because most of it's difficult to kind of get a hold of or to find. Invertebrates, so you could think of invertebrates as insects, make up about 70% of all known species, and probably most of them are yet to be discovered. Again, going back to the beetles are the most diverse species that are on the diverse species group that's on the planet. And it seems like every time people go out to do a survey, they just find more and more and more, which is a good thing. You know, it's eventually there's a way to graph this to say that you found every single species, and I'll show pictures of that after we go through the AP test, how to form those graphs. But what you do is you form a graph of every single time you take a sample, the number of new species that are found, and eventually you'll get to a point where the number of new species that are found becomes smaller and smaller. And you start doing surveys, and there's enough surveys that you do that you could say that you found everything. Even though we know that, yes, that's not the case. There might be a group of insects that are out there that not many exist. You know, there might only be like, you know, less than 1,000 of those. So in order to find them, you have to be in their specific spot of an ecosystem. Tropical rainforests and coral reefs are biodiversity hotspots. We had talked in class one time about why are there more poisonous species in the tropical rainforest than anywhere else? Well, it's because there's just more species there. So you're going to come across more that are poisonous. Same thing with coral reefs. Why are there more species that are there? Well, the environment is very conducive to that, especially tropical rainforest coral reefs. They tend to be in sort of warmer areas or warmer climates. And so you're more conducive. There's a higher amount of productivity in those areas, which can support more species. North America and Europe only contain about 10 to 15% of all the species that we know. Why is that? Well, you have to think that a lot of North America, you're looking at temperate climates, which means that there are spots of the year where productivity is at zero, where there's no primary productivity happening. And so that's going to lead to a lower amount of species diversity. So benefits of biodiversity, it gives you a high amount of food. You go to restaurants and you see massive menus that can almost be novels published by Penguin, and you look at that, and it's because they have a large amount of food. And then there's a restaurant that's nearby me, Brava's, that only serves hamburgers. And each of them kind of has their own benefits restaurant wise, but you have to think about it that if you're in a larger group and people are picky eaters, having a larger menu means that you'll get to a point where you'll have more people satisfied. As many as 80,000 edible wild plant species could be utilized by humans. That doesn't mean that we are going to eat all of them. Drugs and medicine. One of the things that I always did was when I taught biology of plants at Purdue, I always had them write a medicinal plant paper. And pro tip, if you're going to have someone write a medicinal plant paper, make sure that you tell them that they have to clear the species with you beforehand, or you're going to end up reading 50 papers over medicinal marijuana. More than half of all prescriptions contain natural products. Back in the early 1900s and even the late 1800s, plants were used for medicinal properties. And believe it or not, that actually still continues to this day, where like opioids come from plants, caffeine comes from plants. We can make caffeine now, but a lot of like opioids and things like that come from plants and plant products. And then medicinal marijuana, obviously that comes from plants. But there's quite a few other ones. There was a analgesic that was used for the longest time that came from plants. They found out it was toxic later, but it was a really common medication that was used, and it was replaced by Tylenol. Pharmaceutical companies actively prospect tropical countries for products. It is really, really common that you'll see some botanical surveys that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. And it's like, why would a pharmaceutical company be interested in a plant survey in South America? Well, it's because you're sending people down there, and then if they bring back samples, then that gives you an opportunity to kind of test those or to see what chemicals are present within there. There's also some ecological benefits. A lot of these are pretty self-explanatory, like when we talk about ecosystem services. So soil formation, waste disposal, air and water purification, nutrient cycling, solar energy absorption, biogeochemical and hydrological cycles, they all depend on a high amount of biodiversity. And each of these things that I had talked about on here, that's listed under here, could be an entire lesson of its own. And when I was at University of South Dakota working on my PhD, I took a class by a professor named Jeff Wessner, and he taught a class called Ecosystem Ecology. And it was basically all of this stuff. It was ecosystem services. How do we measure it? How does all this stuff work out? What actually happens in water purification? It's a super interesting class, and he was a great professor. I say he was a great professor like he's dead. He's still alive as of today, at least that I know of. Can a system function without all these integral parts? Yes and no. It can, but a lot of times it substitutes it in some different ways. There's also aesthetic and cultural benefits. So cultural diversity, it's inextricably linked to biodiversity. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that Americans spend $104 billion annually on wildlife-related recreation. One of the things that I enjoy to do is go hiking, and one of the things that I don't do is just go hiking around the city of Fort Wayne. You go to parks or other places. Like a really popular place I like to go to is Franke Park. It's got some nice hilly terrain. It's in the woods, so those are places that you go to. And not only that, but I've done, I vacationed in Colorado in the Rocky Mountains, and that was money that I spent to go there and to kind of see the Rocky Mountains and all the things that were happening. A big thing that was kind of brought up is emerald ash borer in the United States. So emerald ash borer is a small little beetle that's a couple centimeters long. It drills into ash trees into their phloem, or bores into the ash trees into their phloem, and it can girdle the tree and effectively kill it. And it goes after black ash, which is a ash tree that grows in swamps and bogs and places like that. The problem is that black ash has a high cultural benefit to Native Americans who used the bark from it for basket weaving and other wood projects. And so emerald ash borer is eliminating this cultural I don't know how to phrase it, this cultural item, I guess, from their culture, and it's eliminating it from their life and their society. And so this is why biodiversity, a lot of times, they look at this like, okay, what are some of the benefits, or who uses these products? Ecotourism can be an important form of sustainable economic development. A big if you look at the state of Colorado, a lot of it is it can't be inhabited because of mountains and logistics of getting things up the mountains. But there is ecotourism. People go there to look at the pine trees and the massive forests and this kind of untouched area where just people haven't been to. And then also just the intrinsic value that it's there. If the reason that people climb Mount Everest is, I don't want to say it's easy, but compared to what are called the 8,000s, the mountains that are above 8,000, it's relatively one of the easiest ones to climb because of the infrastructure and all of this stuff that surrounds climbing Mount Everest. So if it's so easy, then why do people do it? Well, because it exists. It's the tallest mountain, and people want to climb it, even though arguably K2, which is shorter than Everest, is a lot more difficult to climb because a lot of the logistics don't exist there. So threats to biodiversity. Extinction is obviously a massive threat. Once you eliminate, so extinction is the elimination of every member of a species. So an example of that is a species that's about to go extinct is there's a rhino species which only had 3 individuals left, 2 females and 1 male, and the male Sudan passed away a few years ago, and so that's it. Like that species is on a timer now until it's added to that list of extinction. This is a normal process. There's a lot of species. There's what's called the background extinction rate, which is 1 to 5 species every year kind of go extinct due to natural processes. They don't have that genetic diversity and the biodiversity within that population in order to survive, and they're eventually eliminated. In undisturbed ecosystem, background rates appear to be 1 species per decade. I've seen 1 to 5. In this century, human impact have accelerated this rate, causing perhaps hundreds to thousands of extinctions annually. An example of this being the rhino. We hunted them to extinction. Condors, we've hunted to extinction. There's so many species that have gone extinct due to human impacts. A lot of it has been due to what am I trying to think of? Habitat destruction. That's it. Natural causes of extinction. Fossil record suggests more than 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. There's a reason that I don't have a pet T-Rex, and it's because they went extinct. Most went extinct before humans ever arrived. And the end of the Cretaceous, dinosaurs and 50% of all existing genre just disappeared. In the Permian area, I'm struggling with words this morning. It's been a rough morning. Permian period, 2/3 of all marine species and nearly half of all plants and animal families died out. But let's look at the human caused reductions in biodiversity. This is what we're interested in. When we talk about environmental science, we're concerned with, a lot of it is focused on human reduction. So habitat destruction, which I brought up earlier. The biggest reason for the current increase in extinction is habitat loss. If you don't have a place to live, a lot of times a place to live is integral and structural for that organism's life cycle. Habitat. So one of the things going back to that, malaria is the #1 disease or one of the biggest or the deadliest diseases on the planet. If we eliminate mosquitoes are key to their life cycle. So if we destroy part of their habitat in mosquitoes, we destroy malaria. Habitat fragmentation divides population into isolated groups vulnerable to catastrophic events. If you instantly divide up your population, think of it as in Indiana, it's really common to think of how in the middle of farmland, there's these really tiny forests. Looking at those, there was a researcher at Purdue named Rachel, and she did her master's project was looking at those as islands. And because in between in that agricultural land, nothing can survive. She looked a lot at plant species, but there are animal species that are included within that too, that they might not be able to cross that gap in order to make it out to another forest. And because of that, it fragments them. So if something happens to that small forest, it could be catastrophic to all the species that live within there. Hunting and fishing is another one. Overharvesting of game species. This is why hunting licenses are given out so that the population can sustain itself until next year. If someone went out and you're allowed. I don't hunt myself, but say you're allowed to kill 2 deer per year. That's reasonable. That's a family could use that and get a lot of venison and other things from that. But if you say, you know what, you can just hunt year round, then eventually it would cause a depletion in the population. How do we know this? Because it's happened in Indiana where deer were hunted to, you can't say hunted to extinction, local extirpation in Indiana, and there were no deer. So a lot of the deer that exist in Indiana now, or all the deer in Indiana that exist now, were brought in from the outside because they were essentially hunted to local extirpation. So American passenger pigeon is an example of this. Whales right now they're struggling due to hunting. I talked about it yesterday in bio and not in AP Environmental Science, but there is, looking at whales, there are villages along Alaska that they go out and they hunt whales. But they don't just go out there and indiscriminately kill. They kill a whale, they drag it ashore, and they use the blubber as food and the oils from it for fuel for lanterns and fires and things like that. They use the bones to make tools so that they can hunt and things like that. That's different than like Japanese whaling fleets that just go out there and they just, slaughter millions of whales, and those whales, they don't get that exact same use out of it. There's a big difference between hunting one whale and killing indiscriminate groups of them. Again, this goes back to that cultural heritage. What happens if whales are eliminated? Well, a lot of these Alaskan villages of Native Alaskans, they're going to suffer quite a bit when they struggle to find whales in order to support them for that year. They're doing this in a sustainable manner. Habitat fragmentation. So we're going to look at one county in Cadiz Township, Wisconsin. So in 1931, this would have been the survey. Notice how you have quite a few waterways going through, and it's green, I assume, is going to be forested area since it is Wisconsin. Going into 1982, this is where, populations start to move in. Why do these forests still exist in this area? Well, a lot of it is these are going to be wet areas that are formed after a lot of these creeks and rivers have been moved, I guess. So these are these are going to be like wetter forests. And then going into 1902, same exact thing. And then in the 1950s, we see an explosion in the population. There's a lot more people farming, and technology is better. And so this area right here is kind of redone. I want to bring up something on Google Maps really quick. I just don't want people to see my address. So originally, looking at Eagle Marsh, back to that. Looking at Eagle Marsh, this is a Grand McCulloch ditch. This is the Continental Divide. Everything on this side drains into a different watershed than everything on this side, and it cuts right through Fort Wayne. Like this is Ingle Road, this is Jefferson. And then here's where Lutheran Hospital is. So the farmer who lived here, the Grand McCulloch ditch was originally over here in this area, and he actually moved the Continental watershed or the Continental Divide when he made this farmland. The other example is Arrowhead Prairie, which Grand McCulloch ditch number 1 run right here it is. So this is the Aboit Creek. Looking at, I did research at this prairie. Looking at this prairie back in historic photos, there was actually a river that ran through here, and that river was closed off on this farmland, which caused it to dry up here. Now this low area in this spot right here is actually what we use is the division for research. So if you ever read any of my research and you hear North and South Prairie, this is North Prairie and this is South Prairie. And then there's a third one over here that I never did research in. I just focused on these two areas. But this piece of property, the reason that this area was still low when it flooded is because it used to connect to the little river from the Aboit Creek, but this was sectioned off when it came to the farmland. So human caused reductions in biodiversity. So commercial products and live specimens. So wildlife smuggling, believe it or not, is extremely profitable. The current coronavirus right now was caused by the wildlife trade. Leopard fur and then rhino horns. Leopard fur is used as cloth, And then rhino horns are used in traditional Chinese medicine, even though it's been completely disproven. Not everyone has access to that information. U.S. annual pet trade in wild species. There's 2 million reptiles, 1 million amphibians and mammals, and 500,000 birds. A friend of mine is really big into like doing reptiles and stuff like that. And then there's 128,000 tropical fish, often caught with cyanide above coral reefs. My uncle growing up used to have a tropical fish tank in his house. I just remember it because it was so big. It was a massive fish tank, and you just filled it with tropical fish. Predators and pest control. Many animal populations have been greatly reduced and exterminated because they are regarded as dangerous to humans and livestock. The big example of this is what is it? The wolves in Yellowstone. That's kind of the big one that's used. Animal control costs $20 million in federal and state funds annually. 700,000 birds and mammals annually. About 100,000 coyotes. So going back to this really quick, the wolves in Yellowstone were eliminated because of tourism and farmers and things like that. It started to cause a collapse in the ecosystem because it was a keystone species, and then they were reintroduced. But when they were reintroduced, a lot of people did not like that. And the biggest group that didn't like it was farmers, because then they started to go after their cattle and livestock, which cost them money. So exotic species introduction, this is kind of my area of expertise with research. So exotic organisms are organisms introduced into habitats where they're not native. How do you know of that? It's a better definition. They're organisms that are introduced either intentionally or unintentionally by humans into habitats where they did not evolve. Biological pollution. So an example is the kudzu vine. It's also known as the vine that ate the South. Just Google pictures of it and you'll see how bad it is. Purple loosestrife is a really big one. It's kind of invaded a lot of areas. Zebra mussels, which was brought over on cargo ships from Russia. They drew up water into ballast tanks, which caused the ships to sink down a little bit and give them stability at sea. They cruise across, and then before they enter shallow waterways, because running aground is not great for ships, they discharge that water. Ship rises up a little bit, and that's how zebra mussels get passed around. Asian longhorn beetles. So how did Asian longhorn beetles get its name? They were interviewing an entomologist about this beetle. And they were like, how did this beetle become invasive, or what is it? And the scientist's like, it's some Asian longhorned beetle. And so now it's the Asian longhorn beetle. It's from Asia, and it has a longhorn on its nose. Disease is another one. This isn't really thought about a whole lot. When a disease is introduced into a new environment, natural balance can be tipped, leading to an epidemic. This isn't just human disease. Dutch elm disease is a massive fungal infection that's going around right now, and it's thought to have been native to Russia. The reason it's thought to have been native to Russia is because the trees from Russia, the elm trees from Russia, it's a secondary stressor to it. But here in the US, there's a tree right in front of Snyder High School that is not doing great. It grows a couple leaves on it, and that is Dutch elm disease in a nutshell. Look at the bark. The bark shows signs of Dutch elm disease, and it's passed around using beetles. Pollution is another one. So adding toxic pollutants into the water. One of the things was near discharge drains to water treatment plants. They found that a lot of fish were having what are called ovotestes. They were both male and female and incapable of reproduction. Why? Because the water treatment plants didn't filter out pharmaceuticals, and women were taking birth control and then using the restroom, and that was going into the water and causing problems for fish. Pesticides is a big one. Having pesticides into the water can cause issues on secondary targets. Lead, another big one. It used to be a common insult when I was younger that you would ask if somebody ate paint chips when they were little, because we used to put lead in paint. And so if you did that, it caused mental problems. Genetic assimilation, which is something that you almost never hear about. So how do we protect this? Well, we have hunting and fishing laws. By the 1890s, most states had enacted some hunting and fishing laws. The general idea was pragmatic. It wasn't aesthetic or moral preservation. So they just did it because they could. You know, if I can charge you, I can say, you know, for a hunter, it's $10 for a hunting license, and that gives you 2 deer. I've just made $10. So the Endangered Species Act, the ESA, established in 1973. Endangered are those that are considered in imminent danger of extinction. Threatened are those likely to become endangered, at least locally, in the near future. This is kind of a big deal. When I did research, it was one of those things that we had to pay attention to endangered and threatened species. In case we encountered one when we went out, we did not take a sample of that and put it into a press. Vulnerable are those that are naturally rare or have been locally depleted to a level that puts them at risk. An example is the plants that grow in serpentine soils in California. It's not that those plants are endangered because of human activity. They're just rare because they can only grow in a certain type of soil found in that area. ESA regulates a wide range of activities involving endangered species. So taking, which, you know, there's also harassing, harming, pursuing, hunting, shooting, killing, capturing, or collecting, either accidentally or on purpose. That's a big one. Accidentally or on purpose, which means that if you go out to hunt deer, you just can't indiscriminately shoot every single species along the way. Selling is another big one. If you are in possession of an endangered species, you cannot sell it. With a lot of pest agencies, it's really common that sometimes with pest agencies that they won't actually like kill the species. They'll just remove it from your property if they know it to be endangered. Importing into or exporting out of the US. This is a big one that a lot of people kind of bring up. It is kind of controlled, but you have to think that that customs are looking more for contraband. Possessing the species, just having it as a pet, transporting and shipping it. So currently, the U.S. has 1,500 species on its endangered and threatened list, and about 500 candidates species that are waiting for consideration. The number reflects more about human interest than actual status. Invertebrates make up 75% of all the endangered species that are out there, endangered or threatened, but only 9% are on the TE list. The listing process can be extremely slow. The reason being is because you have to enforce a lot of this stuff that's out there. Imagine if mosquitoes became an endangered or a threatened species and it became illegal to just swat them. It becomes very difficult to kind of enforce those rules. So recovery plans. Remember, one of the things that I always talk about is, yes, it's easy to identify a problem. For example, I have lead paint on my house. So we can make a rule that says, hey, no more painting houses with lead paint. But what do we do about all the houses that are already painted? So we have to look at how to prevent it, but also remediation. So once a species is listed, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is required to propose a recovery plan detailing the rebuilding of the species to sustainable levels. Total cost of all current plans is around $5 billion. I know it seems like a lot of money, but it's really not all that much. Opponents have continually tried to require economic costs and benefits be incorporated into planning. Private land and critical habitat. 8% of habitat for more than half of all listed species is on non-public property. As in, if you have an endangered species on your property yourself, then how do we go about that? The Supreme Court has ruled destroying habitat equates to taking. So even if that habitat is on your property, if it contains rare endangered species, then you can be charged if you destroy it. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been negotiating habitat conservation plans with private homeowners. Usually what it does is it says don't do anything with this section of property and we'll give you tax breaks, or, you know, there's a benefit to it, right? It's difficult to tell somebody like, no, you can't do anything with this portion of the land that you own, but you still have to pay taxes on it. So they end up coming to some sort of deal that allows that property to remain intact. Landowners are allowed to harvest resources as long as species benefit. So reauthorizing ESEA, it expired in 1992. Proposals for new ESEA generally fall into two categories: versions that encourage ecosystems and habitat protection rather than individual species, and safe harbor policies that allow exceptions to critical habitat designations. And a lot of this is economic considerations. Minimum viable population is the minimum population size required for long-term viability of a species. So thinking about the rhinos where there's only 2 left and both are females, it's obviously not great for the minimum viable population. There's also the theory of island biogeography. So small islands far from mainlands have fewer terrestrial species than larger, closer species. This is always a big question for the AP exam, so pay attention to that. Which species would have more biodiversity? And it's always one that's larger and closer to the mainland rather than one that's smaller and further away. MacArthur and Wilson proposed that species diversity is a balance between colonization and extinction rate. With island biogeography, a lot of it comes down to the research of E.O. Wilson and Daniel Simberloff, when Daniel Simberloff was E.O. Wilson's student at Harvard. Diversity loss in smaller populations, you can end up with founder effect, where a few individuals end up starting a new population. Demographic bottleneck, or the bottleneck effect, which is where few individuals survive a catastrophe. Now, out of these, it tends to be random. There's also genetic drift. This is where there's a random reduction in gene frequency. And then inbreeding is where there's mating between closely related individuals. You can actually do this mathematically and come up with F, which is an inbreeding coefficient. Habitat protection, the latest management strategy is preservation of ecosystems supporting maximum biological diversity rather than by species, species by species approach. So rather than just saying like, hey, there's like 3 cats and 2 birds in this population that are rare, it's just like, hey, this habitat contains rare species. There's gap analysis, which is conservationists and wildlife managers look for unprotected landscapes that are species rich. So this is a kind of a broad scale holistic approach. So here's a map of Hawaii. And if you look at where there is a high amount of endangered species and things like that, you end up with these, and where the preservations are, or the wildlife preserves are located at. You could just see how like fragmentation can kind of occur within it. And this is a fairly large island. This is the main island. You can tell Kona and Hilo. So international wildlife treaties. So one of them is CITES, the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species in 1975. This is a big one as long as it's enforced. This is regulated trade of living specimens and products derived from listed species. The big ones to think, so rhino horns, ivory from elephants, stuff like that. Captive breeding. Breeding programs in zoos and botanical gardens are one method of saving threatened species sometimes. They're usually kind of low on genetic diversity. But if you're just trying to save a species, a lot of times genetic diversity isn't the first thing that's on your mind. Most mammals in North American zoos are now produced from captive breeding programs. There are a lot of species that don't reproduce well in captivity. Some zoos now participating in reintroduction programs, which is where you take a species and send them back out into the wild. Zoos have limited space for captive breeding. Taking a look at the Fort Wayne Children's Zoo, there's a lot of those enclosures kind of meet the minimum federal requirements. So how many can or should we save? Ultimate problem is that natural habitats may disappear while conserving the species itself. So if there's a bird that requires a specific type of tree and that tree is gone, it doesn't matter if we have them in captivity, they have no habitat to go back to. An example of this is peanut butter or different types of like butters like that use palm oil as a substitute. those palm oils come from trees, and those trees in turn are habitats for orangutans. So by removing those trees, we are removing habitats for orangutans. And that's why a lot of people have looked for peanut butters and things specifically that do not contain palm oil, because it's more environmentally friendly, because it doesn't reduce that. If you ever looked at Mr. Beast's Team Trees initiative that he did last year, a big part of that was the habitat conservation for palm oils and palm trees. Another alternative is attempt to save the species in the wild. This is obviously the best approach, but it's whether it's practical or not. Provide funding for protection in native habitats. So to kind of summarize this, we had gone over species and biodiversity and species definitions, and what makes a species is very, very difficult. And then there's three big methods of biodiversity. The benefits of having biodiversity, especially with genetic biodiversity, the current threats to that, and then the human caused threats, which are something that we kind of focus on quite a bit. Biodiversity protection, what are some of the international treaties, laws, things like that are in place in order to protect them? So the Endangered Species Act, looking at minimum viable population, and then international treaties like CITES. And then captive breeding programs, which again do have benefits, some positive, some negative. This is kind of a long one, lecture, but I think that this is kind of one of the most important ones. And the reason being is because biodiversity really plays into the whole purpose of environmental science. Like environmental science, kind of the goal is to get an understanding about the environment in order to protect biodiversity and to protect what's out there. This is kind of the big definition behind conservation. And so it is something that a lot of people find interesting. It's a lot, and it tends to be pretty heated. Conservation costs money, and that's money that's kind of taken away from other things. Like, why should we care about cutting down a tree for palm oil when we can use that palm oil to feed a family, and the money could also be used to help feed that family? And there's a big debate around it, and it's one of those things where a lot of times this is where you kind of come up with these mutual agreements with, and so it's important. And I think it's one of the more interesting topics. It's definitely one of those that people get into debates quite a bit over, and I think that that's important. It's important to have conversations surrounding this. But that's where I'm going to leave it at for today. So that will be the end of the stream. Thanks everyone for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments. I will be over on Google Meets here in a moment, but thank you very much.